Welcome to the Ashby Village Science and Ideas Group. I'm Joe Evinger, and I help coordinate this group's events with the additional help and co-host tech expert Hillary Naylor. All of our members here have varied educational work experience backgrounds, but we all love science and new ideas. There are about 70 members now, and another 100 who occasionally come as a guest. We meet via Zoom the second Thursday of each month at around 3 o'clock and go until about 4:30. We have a different guest speaker each month who speaks to us on a topic related to science and ideas. In the coming months, we have John Perlin in February. He will speak to us about climate change, forest, and deforestation. On March 13th, Dr. Dennis Titoff will discuss his work in deciphering the molecular basis of aging. Might concern a few of us. In April, Ellen Bruno will discuss her work in managing agricultural water sources in California. In May, Jim Gasparini will give a talk on how we domesticated fire and how fire domesticated us. Later on in the year, we'll have someone speak about his new book, Most Delicious Poison, Noah Whiteman, a book about poisons. We're always looking for new speakers. If any of you personally know someone, please recommend them to me along with their contact information. We invite all Ashby Village members to join our group. Others interested in Ashby Village and our presentations are always welcome. Ashby Village is a 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofit organization. I asked Hillary to place a link in from the website into the chat. To our guests, please consider a donation to Ashby Village or joining our organization via our website. Before Sarah introduces today's speaker, Matthew Shindell, I'd like to read a partial quote from the very end of his book, For the Love of Mars, which goes on to say the idea of anthropogenic climate change, that is human-caused planetary scale change, has caused us to consider whether life as we live it is a threat to the life as we know it. Sarah will now introduce our today's speaker, Matthew Shindell. Sarah?
Thanks, Joe. Matthew Shindell, PhD, is a historian of science with a background in science studies. He is curator of Earth and Planetary Science at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. He is responsible for the museum's collection of spacecraft, instruments, and other artifacts related to the exploration and study of our Earth and solar system. He also co-hosts the museum's podcast, Airspace. He has curated the museum's permanent exhibition, Exploring the Planets, and is leading a curatorial team developing the exhibition Futures in Space. Shindell is the author of For the Love of Mars, A Human History of the Red Planet, published in 2023, and The Life and Science of Harold C. Urey, 2019, co-author of Spaceships, also 2023, Our Future in Space, 2023, and Discerning Experts, 2019. He is co-editor of Smithsonian American Women, which was published in 2019. Thank you for being with us today, Matt. We're really excited to have you with us.
Thank you. Let me pull up my slideshow. And we'll get things started. All right, does that come through all right?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone, for coming to this talk or, tuning in for this talk. Thank you to Joe for the invitation to come and speak with you. And thanks to Hillary and Sarah for helping to host this event. It's, I always jump at a chance to talk about this book because this book was a lot of fun for me to write. And over the last 2 years, introducing people to the book has just been a lot of fun. So I am a curator at the National Air and Space Museum. As Sarah mentioned, I curate the Planetary Science Collection, as well as the Earth Science Collection. there, and I've been doing that work for about 10 years. And prior to that, I was, trained as a historian of science at UC San Diego, and then, spent some years doing research and teaching at various different institutions before coming to the museum. So the last 10 years have been kind of a transition for me in going from being an academic historian to being in a more public facing role, designing exhibitions and speaking to the public about things related to our collections. Now, so this book is still a history of science book. I haven't stopped being a historian of science. And in fact, this book was an opportunity for me to kind of take a little bit of a departure from talking about 20th and 21st century exploration of Mars with robotic rovers, which is, a very exciting development that we've lived through, since landing the first lander on Mars in the 1970s up to today, where we have multiple rovers operating simultaneously on the surface of Mars, studying the surface up close, right? That's been an incredible development, and we've learned a ton about Mars. But Mars has been with us for much, much longer, for as long as we've been keeping records, and even well before that. So I wanted to explore that deeper history and think about what kinds of science people were doing in different periods and how Mars participated in their view of the world and their investigations of that world. So let me take just a second to set up what the history of science is in terms of how I approached it for this book. Um, so I like to think about science not just as what we know it as today, but as an activity that has taken many and sometimes contradictory forms over the course of all of human history. So we find it everywhere that we find groups of people asking questions about the world and generating knowledge about the world. I say groups of people rather than individuals because I think that science as a social activity done by communities of people in dialogue, either with their contemporaries or their antecedents, is really how we should understand science, not just as something that individual geniuses do in laboratories or, developing new theories, but something that's really done in conversation with both communities of people in the present and people who wrote and thought in the past. And I think history is one way of piecing those stories together, taking the records that exist from previous times and cultures and trying to fit what they knew and the projects they initiated to learn about the world with how they lived and what their values were, how they understood their relationships to the world, their relationships to each other, and what their anxieties and preoccupations were, so that we can then compare those to ours and get a sense of why our approach might be a little bit different. That's not just about, well, we have other instruments and we know different things, etc., but more about, how we ourselves are somewhat different than the folks in the past. So that's what defined my approach to this book. I've focused on the people who cared about Mars and the questions that they asked about Mars in their time and place. And I wasn't very concerned with what they got right or wrong about Mars and how their knowledge might have added up to eventually what we now know about Mars. But instead, I really just wanted to get to know Mars through their eyes. And I hope that this could help make me, give me a sense of the time we live in now and our plans for Mars and start to think about those in context. So before going too far with that, let me introduce a short cast of characters, sort of mutual friends of the planet Mars. Some of the folks who did pay attention to Mars. So here we have a temple in the city-state of Palenque, located at the center of the Mayan cosmos, where a Mayan priest might look up at three planets lined up from east to west in the sky above this temple of inscriptions. And at one point in history, they would have seen the planets Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sky together. Well, that priest and the assembled crowd would see three gods in the sky that night who gave birth to their ancient ancestors. And then they would watch them disappear behind the tomb in which their new king's father had recently been laid to rest, confirming and enacting in the sky the transfer of celestial power from father to son. Or several centuries later, On the other side of the world, a 14th century Italian poet imagined a journey through the heavens conceived as a set of nested spheres that hold the planets, stars, and the domain of God and all of the angels. Mars would be one of the stops on that journey, and the poet would give the planet new significance. And then the 17th century, jumping forward, a Jesuit scholar in Rome imagined a similar journey through the heavens that for the first time treated Mars and the other planets as solid worlds that a person could visit. His rendering of Mars was shaped by his ideas about Christianity, astronomy, but also alchemy and magic, as we're going to see. And then in the 20th century, a wealthy astronomer from Boston builds an observatory in the mountains of Flagstaff, Arizona to observe Mars. His obsession with the red planet and with its possible inhabitants reflected his own anxieties about the eventual fate of Earth and the need for a well-structured social hierarchy in order to face whatever challenges might come. And then to put myself in the story, here in the 21st century, a museum curator working with scientists to build a gallery about the exploration of our solar system, starting to write a book about Mars. So I place myself in this context as well. Now, as I was saying earlier, when I was on the first or second slide, we can't talk about the exploration of the planets without talking about Mars. Aside from Earth, it's the most explored planet in our solar system. And that's mainly thanks to the technologies and the methods that have been made possible by how we live on Earth and the technologies that we've developed in order to live these, lives that we live today, very connected to space technologies. We have rockets that are born from our military and national security needs. We have computers and communication technologies that have become ubiquitous and essential for our work and our social lives, and through which we're talking now, and networks for sharing information around the globe. And it also connects to our ideas about the purpose of Mars, its connection to Earth, and dreams of one day sending humans there to explore or even to settle. But let's step back for a moment. For most of human history, this red rocky world that we see on the right was not what people saw in the sky when they looked at Mars. What did they see? Since so many ancient cultures associated Mars with bad omens, we can speculate that these associations go back very deep in the human past. Mars can have a blood red appearance. Mars can be noticeably bright and red, especially when it comes near to Earth during the close opposition. And what you're seeing in the slide there, the moving part of the slide, is a diagram of what we know today to be the motions of the Earth and Mars. You can see Earth is on the inside track, Mars on the outside track. And what you're actually seeing with the line that comes out on the very edge is the apparent motion of Mars in the sky because of the movement of the two planets. And the diagram above the moving diagram shows you what that looks like in the sky during one close approach of Mars and Earth, which is that it actually starts to look like Mars is sort of doing a little loop and turning around and going a different direction for a short period of time. This was what was known as retrograde motion. Mars would seem to go backwards in the sky. And also during those periods, Mars would get a lot brighter because it was a lot closer to Earth during those periods. But it was really just an effect of the motion of both the Earth and Mars, as I said, as Earth is sort of passing Mars on the inside track. It happens once just about every 2 years because of the orbital periods of both Earth and Mars. So that irregular motion in the sky and the red color and the brightness, additional brightness during those periods, maybe made people think of Mars almost like a wounded animal in the sky, this sort of blood red appearance, an animal kind of losing its bearings, or maybe it was unruly, some kind of unruly force in the sky. And because the distance between the Earth and Mars differs over the course of each 2-year cycle, it can differ so much that the brightness of Mars at opposition can be 50 times greater than at other times. So it wasn't like every 2 years you saw the same opposition happen. It could be different from each 2 year cycle from one to another. And so even that sort of irregularity or unruly uh, movement of Mars could be very different from one cycle to another. There wasn't really much people felt like they could rely on when it came to Mars and its motion in the sky, other than that it could bring surprises. Um, well, that's not entirely true. So the Maya are maybe an exception to this idea that people saw bad omens when they saw Mars in the sky. A lot of ancient skywatching cultures developed very sophisticated understandings of what they witnessed in the sky and who related these sky events to how their societies were structured and governed. This fell to the sort of astronomer, astrologer, priests of those ancient societies. And in the case of the Maya, they had a very sophisticated astronomy that was recorded in several different forms, most of which were destroyed, unfortunately, but we still have some codices like this one that you see in front of you that do still record, still hold what the Maya saw in their ancient period. So the Maya, like other ancient civilizations, saw themselves in conversation with their gods and saw themselves as co-participants with the gods in maintaining the order and the harmony of the natural world. And Mayan civilization, which emerged in the southern part of Mesoamerica on Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula and parts of Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras, um, the Mesoamerican civilization, which took root right around 1500 BCE. So the Maya lived in a universe in which everything was alive with spiritual power, and in which very little was actually considered to be inanimate. And so what you see in this diagram in front of you, the zoomorph, or the sort of figure that's made out of multiple different aspects of different animals and even human, one archaeologist has named this zoomorph the Mars beast. So what does it actually have to do with Mars? So you can see that it's a chimera of various animal features. Like I said, it's hanging upside down from segments of what archaeologists call a sky band, which represents the sun's annual path through the stars and the constellations in the sky. It's peeking out from those constellations is what you're seeing as it hangs down. And what the beast seems to be doing, which is sort of confirmed by the corresponding text that goes along with it, is becoming brighter, showing more of itself as time goes on. So maybe, the archaeologists posit, maybe what we're seeing here is Mars going into opposition, becoming brighter, redder, and changing direction in the sky. And these same archaeologists have argued that this Mars beast was not a bad omen, but a signal of seasonal change. The tables that are associated with the beast are actually water tables that correspond to the tropical growing seasons and expectations of rain. So the Maya seem to have found a connection between the erratic motion of Mars and the seasons that, may have held true for several generations. And this could have been valuable archaeological knowledge to the Maya, who, of course, were a very large population of people with about 2 million. And that population size was made possible by a very vast agricultural system. So Mars, in this case, was sort of folded into knowledge about the seasons. And Mars could also play other roles in the night sky. I gave you a little bit of a preview of that in the opening slides. The planets were understood to participate in community life. Palaces and temples in Mayan city-states were designed so that events that took place in the night sky could also take part in communal events. Astronomer, astrologer, priests were employed by the royal families who ruled those city-states to interpret the movements of the planets and develop calendrical and astrological knowledge in the service of the royal family. One of the public ways they expressed this was through the reenactments of the Mayan creation story, which we know today as the Popol Vuh, which established the king's relationship to the gods who had enacted the creation. And in these reenactments, the world was understood to be connected to the sky and the underworld, and the night sky visually replayed parts of the story in its annual movements. I already mentioned in the introduction how Mars and two other planets put on a show over the Temple of Inscriptions on one night in 690 BCE. What did the crowd see on that night? Anthropologists argue that they watched the reunion of three gods who had given birth to the ancient ancestors, and then they saw them disappear behind the tomb in which their new king's father had been laid to rest, confirming the transfer of celestial power from father to son. And Mars, on that night, shining bright, moving slowly through the constellations, was associated with one of the original gods of the creation and one of the oldest, also one of the god's most powerful priests. So Mars took on incredible significance on that evening. Now, a lot of what we talk about in the history of science when we talk about Mars goes back to the ancient Greeks, and especially to the ideas that then got put forward by the Roman astronomer Claudius Ptolemy in the 1st century. He wrote his works from the Roman Egyptian city of Alexandria, where he was associated with the city's museums and libraries, and he had access to Greek, Egyptian, and Babylonian knowledge. Ptolemy's planetary astronomy expressed primarily in his book, The Almagest, which he didn't title The Almagest, but later his admirers titled it The Almagest, which it can be translated to mean the greatest, because they thought it was the greatest book on astronomy ever written. And the Almagest was the most mathematically sophisticated astronomical work that the world had yet seen. And Ptolemy's aim, following in Aristotle's lead, was to describe and predict the observed position of the planets through combinations of perfect circular motions with the Earth at the center of that system. Ptolemy's contributions didn't end with his predictive planetary astronomy. He had an idea of the value that this tool had to the historical science of astrology. So in addition to his Almagest, he also wrote a set of 4 books that traditionally have been called the Tetrabiblos, or the 4 books, devoted to a systemic study of the effects of the planets on the world below and the practice of astrology. These works contain arguments in favor of astrology, as well as an encyclopedic presentation of ancient astrological knowledge. This went beyond what we think of today as astrology, what you'd read in the newspaper, for example. It was interested rather in how the planets affected all aspects of the world, not just individual fates. So this included what people, animals, and things would be found in different parts of the world that were governed by different signs and different planets. And Ptolemy's astrology understood the planets to have influences on the world via this Aristotelian view that every part of the world was connected. There was no empty space. Ptolemy's compendium of what planets would influence and how reflected not only Greek and Roman knowledge about the world, but also prejudices about the people of other lands. And so you find a lot of these prejudices in his understanding of how Mars, for example, would affect different peoples that came under his influence. So Mars determined the mental character and physical features of people of the world and properties of the lands that they inhabited. So Ptolemy describes the nature of Mars as chiefly to dry and to burn, and the malevolence of Mars could bring all kinds of ill effects. It could cause political problems, war, tyranny, civil unrest, arson, murder, piracy, enslavement, any negative virtue, practically, you could blame on Mars. And to the body, in terms of understanding its medical effects, Mars could be understood to cause symptoms mild like fevers or severe. If someone died quickly and violently, this could be considered attributable to Mars. And also, Mars could have a bad effect on the air. It could bring hot weather, pestilence, lightning, hurricanes, drought. It could also bring other problems, deaths of animals, plagues of locusts, and fires, right? if we were living in the medieval world, we might be blaming the wildfires or the brush fires in California on Mars today. So these medieval Europeans who came to be influenced by Ptolemy regarded the planets not as worlds the way that we do today, but as part of a one world system. As the 14th century Parisian scholar Thémon de Judaeus wrote, every natural power of this inferior sensible world is governed by the heavens. Everything that happens on Earth is being dictated by what's happening above the Earth. Life was defined by change, birth, growth, maturation, degeneration, death, decay. Imagining a world in which planetary motion stopped really meant imagining a world in which all of those things stopped as well. It would be a frozen world in which nothing could come into being and nothing could change. And this was all understood to be the design of the creator. And Jewish, Muslim, and Christian scholars all agreed that God in his wisdom had created this one world system, and that it was the mechanism through which that God enacted his will. And the planets were an essential part of this divinely ordered world. And again, not planets, not worlds in their own right. Planet did not yet mean world in the medieval view. And the planets were defined by their effects on things, bodies, and places on this Earth, on what was considered the sublunar world or the only world. So for physicians who followed the teachings of Galen, Mars was most likely to affect the left ear, the kidney, the veins, the gallbladder, the genitals. Ptolemy's treatise on astrology said that Mars could cause men to spit blood, make them melancholy, weaken their lungs, cause itch, cause scurvy. The image on the left is sort of a handy reference that a medieval physician might have carried with him to remind him of which organs and parts of the body were more susceptible to which planets and which constellations. That's one version. There are many versions out there. And on the right is sort of an understanding of the way that the world was organized in that sort of Aristotelian worldview with the Earth at the center, with the four changeable elements of earth, water, air, and fire. And then beyond the moon, everything was made of a perfect ether. So if you took that physics seriously, and most late medieval natural philosophers did take it seriously, then nothing made from those four earthly elements could travel into the heavens of the sort of perfect ether. If one did manage to somehow do so, what they would find was that the differences in the heavens between spheres, planets, stars weren't due to any differences in what they were made of. Everything was made out of ether. And ether itself had no real sensory qualities or contraries, and so it had no solidity, no weight. It was all ether, for lack of a better word. But that doesn't mean that medieval thinkers didn't find ways to imagine going to other planets, and this is where tapping into medieval literature and then in later chapters to science fiction allows us to kind of think about how different conceptions of Mars were imagined. So in the medieval era, they visited Mars in ways that reflected that sort of shape and structure of the worldview I just described, and also the view of nature and the understanding of the purpose of human life, of mortality, of the body, and the nature of the soul. And they did this in ways that evoked the ancient texts that they were drawing upon, as well as their enthusiasm for the powers held in those ancient texts. And the most famous medieval journey through the universe is really, without a doubt, Dante Alighieri's 14th century Divine Comedy. A few significant differences separate Dante's journey from the, oh, excuse me, that I meant to take that sentence out. Let's skip over that. So the 14th century Divine Comedy. The Divine Comedy is presented as a first-person account of a journey through the three realms of the dead. Dante and his guide, Beatrice, are permitted to travel through the sphere of fire at the edge of the sensory world and through each of the 9 heavenly spheres and the Empyrean. And we're just going to focus on Dante's encounter with Mars here. But he does encounter everything from the moon all the way out to the stars, and then beyond the stars, God's Imperium. But let's just talk about Mars. So in Dante's journey, he learns that the spheres of the planets are each devoted to one of the 7 virtues. So if you remember from reading the Inferno, I read it in high school as part of my English course. As Dante descends through hell, each level of hell represents a vice. It's the opposite as he goes into the planetary spheres. He encounters instead the virtues. And Mars, which is found within the first 4 virtues, which are the virtues of prudence, fortitude, justice, and temperance, Mars, he decides, will be the planet of fortitude. And in keeping with the long-held association of Mars with war, what Dante decides to do is that he imagines the sphere of Mars to be occupied by holy warriors who died as martyrs, who gave their lives in the name of their Christian faith. And of course, the most important martyr to a medieval Christian would have been Jesus himself, who died on the cross. And this happens in the middle of Dante's journey. It's the 5th of the 9 spheres that he describes in the heavens, and it's one of the most dramatic moments in the entire Paradiso. So Dante had speculated in a separate text that because of its central position, combined with its hot and dry qualities, Mars could appear as a ball of fire, flaming red with bright vapors. This is how he described Mars's brightness, its color, is because of its central position in the heavens. So it's not surprising that when Dante approaches Mars in the Paradiso, he's at first overwhelmed by just the brightness of the planet. As he sees it more clearly, that brightness resolves into millions of sparks or rays of light that make a cross, or a symbol, again, of that ultimate martyr. And the cross is animated by the souls of the lesser martyrs and emanates hymns of holy devotion that those souls are singing as they move around the cross. And at one point, from amidst those lights that make up the cross, one of Dante's own martyred ancestors comes to speak to him, explains to him the significance of the cross on Mars, and offers to name all of the martyrs who make up its light. And the famous martyrs, as they're named, their lights flash and they move around the cross. And Dante describes this visual experience, including a splendor thrust along the cross and a flame wheel around itself, as he watches like a falconer who tracks his falcon's flight. So it's this incredible kind of fireworks show that he's watching on this cross. And he has this incredibly holy experience there on Mars. And his description of this journey influenced imaginary journeys into the heavens even after early telescopic observations began to reorder and transform the planets from these ethereal points of light into worlds. And so thinking about one experience that comes after Dante, in the 14th century, or excuse me, if we leave Dante in the 14th century and jump to the 17th century, to a time when Galileo Galilei and his fellow Copernican Johannes Kepler have started transforming ideas about what the planets are and what they actually look like by using the telescope, we do find folks starting to change what this journey through the planets might look like. But it wasn't a Copernican who imagined one of the most detailed trips to Mars in this century, but it was a Jesuit scholar, a natural philosopher, a humanist, Athanasius Kircher. He's not a household name today, not like Galileo and Kepler, but in his day, Kircher was the center of a very large intellectual network. He had a keen interest in astronomy, astrology, alchemy, and magic, and of course, as a Jesuit priest in Rome, Christianity. He observed eclipses, studied the sky with telescopes, made his own observations of sunspots, and he produced and published depictions of the moon, Jupiter, and Saturn. He was a very prolific scientist and author. And in 1657, Kircher published an imagined journey to the planets in his itinerarium ecstaticum, or the ecstatic journey. And in the story, we meet the character Theodidactus, which translates to taught by God, who is transported into the planetary spheres by the angel Cosmiel. So it's very much like Dante's journey into the heavens, only instead of being guided by Beatrice, he has an angelic guide to take him into what is now a transforming planetary system. And the Mars that Cosmiel and Theodidactus visit on their voyage isn't based on known features of the planet. In fact, there were really no known features of Mars yet at this point. And Kierkegaard provides no drawings or maps of Mars. He really only had access to vague descriptions of what others had observed through their telescopes during oppositions, and these were mostly the blurry red disk of Mars. So Kierkegaard's Mars was his own invention, and it's based on his own speculations about the planet and his understanding of its influence on humans and the reasons for its bright red appearance. So as Theo and Cosmiel travel from the sun to Mars, Theo begins to feel the planet's malevolence. He says, "It seems as if I'm not so much seeing some hellish globe with my eyes as smelling the incredible stench of its vapors, and it's not lifeless. It's roiled by a huge whirling vortex." He asks the angel who's transporting him to stop, not to take him any nearer to Mars. He can tell, he says, that that globe holds evil things in store for him. And there's some kind of deep-seated fury inside of him. He's sort of burning with rage and ready to brawl. And this being a Jesuit priest who we have to assume was probably mild-mannered most of the time. But those ill effects are relieved for him by the angel, who gives him essentially a antidote for the effects of Mars and allows him to breathe normally in the planet's foul air. And the angel explains to him that the reason he's been feeling all of these strong emotions is because of that violent influence of the planet Mars. So even though Kierkegaard is imagining Mars as a physical place and he's about to set foot on the planet, he's still thinking of its primary purpose in the world to be its influence on humans and on the earthly world. But even after taking that antidote, Mars is a pretty unpleasant place for Theo. He described it as being primarily made of sulfur and bitumen and arsenic and other foul chemicals. He gets to stand on the rim of a volcano and survey the Martian landscape. And the surface of Mars that he sees is this rocky, mountainous planet, which not so different from how we know it today, but it's covered in fireball spewing volcanoes and lakes of burning pitch. It's essentially hell on another planet. And he takes Theo to the edge of a flaming ocean, an ocean of pitch and bitumen, rough and scaly in appearance and porridge-like in consistency. And Theo asks the angel why a planet like this would exist, why such a foul planet in God's perfect universe. And Cosmiel reminds him that Mars, like the more beautiful and benevolent planets they've seen on their journey, is a work of God and part of the universe's greater whole, and essentially there to do the work that people have understood for centuries Mars does, which is to cause change to happen on Earth. And so it works in concert with the other planets. Again, even though we have this very vivid description of a physical world that Kierkegaard gives us, Kierkegaard is still mainly understanding Mars and its significance as being the work that it does for God in terms of what it does for Earth. And this is just to give you a sense of that universe that Kierkegaard inhabited. Again, similar to the illustrations I showed you before, here we have both the sort of universe itself with all of its different layers of the heavenly spheres, but then at the center of that universe is what was understood as the microcosm, or the human body, and all of the effects that those spheres would then have on the microcosm, or the body. Now, jumping forward to the 19th century, to the astronomer Percival Lowell. Lowell promoted his own idea of planetary evolution, which was very different from Kierkegaard's understanding of the reasons why the planets existed or why they would be the way that they were. According to Lowell's ideas, planets started out essentially wet, and over time became desert worlds. The moon, for example, was a desert. Mars was in the process of becoming a desert. And when Lowell looked at Mars, he saw it covered in canals, which had at first been described by the Italian astronomer Schiaparelli earlier in that century. Now, Lowell saw these canals as evidence of a large, coordinated civil engineering project that must be conducted by a race of very intelligent Martians. The Martians were contending with a drying planet. They were trying to irrigate crops and keep populations alive. All of this Lowell saw through the eyepiece of his telescope in Flagstaff. And during each opposition every 2 years, he would see these canals grow and change in direction and shape, and infer that the Martians were just continuously expanding this canal system to bring scarce water to their agricultural regions. And he feared that Earth would eventually succumb to the same fate as Mars. The deserts of the Earth would grow and would spread. As Lowell once famously wrote, what is frightening about deserts on Earth is not that they exist, but that they are coming into being, that they would eventually grow and take over the entire planet. Lowell's ideas provoked a lot of sensational journalism and stories about Martians during the late 19th century, and the most famous reaction to the Martians was H.G. Wells's novel, The War of the Worlds. Here we have resource-starved Martians who come to Earth to take what they need from inferior humans who have to run for their lives from beings who don't regard them as intelligent equals. And for Wells, of course, this was a satirical comment on the British Empire and its exploits abroad, but also can be read as a very logical kind of extension of ideas of Mars at the time and what types of beings might live there. For Wells, these weren't going to be intellectual and thoughtful Martians, but rather completely Martians with their own ideas about what they needed and what they were willing to do to get it. Now, in the 1960s and 70s, a new Mars was revealed through robotic exploration, and this is the era, the beginning of the era that the collections that I curate have a lot to say about. So here we have, for example, an image from 1976 of one of the Viking landers that landed on Mars. It didn't plant a flag in quite the same way that the Apollo lunar landings that happened in 1969 did, but instead, carried that flag on board a robotic vessel. So you can see the flag. I'll use my mouse here to point it out right there on top of the lander. And that's essentially the first flag planted on the surface of Mars at least by a successful mission. A few others crashed before that one. But this also is the beginning of sort of our new vision of Mars as a world that doesn't have extant life or flowing water, but instead is a desert world that has perhaps a lot of water locked up in its ice caps and maybe underneath the dust and underneath the surface in frozen aquifers, but that at least on the surface is essentially a dry desert world. And it's also a world that's defined by rocks and that has been, explored primarily by rock experts, geologists. And the tools that they've used to study Mars have been primarily tools that were developed either, during the space race, during the Cold War, and after, as we've, integrated space technologies more and more into our everyday lives and also into our governmental and military operations. So it's very much a Mars of our time. And fiction about Mars no longer was about existing Martian life. We weren't encountering Martians either invading Earth, or we weren't invading their lives on Mars, but instead we were bringing Mars into our lives, bringing our lives to Mars. But for what purpose? In the movie Total Recall, which is based on a short story by Philip K. Dick, what we see is humans using Mars as a mining colony, taking resources from Mars for use on Earth. And that's been a trope that's been borrowed by several science fiction novels and films and television shows since then. And it's only really been reinforced, the idea that Mars is a place with no things or no people and no animals, but only rocks, right? Potential resources, by continued exploration. Here we see the most recent US Mars explorer, the Perseverance rover, along with its Ingenuity helicopter, which I was very excited to be able to collect the prototype of that helicopter to put on display in the museum. So to visit our Udvar Hazy Center in Virginia, you'll see the prototype of the helicopter that went to Mars. And this exploration has just continued with more rovers, more capable rovers landing on Mars with each mission. And although right now it's in a little bit of political jeopardy, the plan of eventually bringing samples back from Mars to study on Earth to get an even better sense of the geologic history of that planet. But it's really one where we have explored Mars to such an extent at this point that we can tell very complicated stories about the history of that planet and what it means for the history of our planet in terms of what we can understand from Mars that we can't see on an Earth that constantly recycles its crust. And it's also the way we explore Mars today is very much just like the medieval period. We could see the connection between ideas about how Mars is explored and how people were living on Earth. We can see that when we look at how people talk about Mars exploration today, that we very much situate it in the way that we live today and the way that we communicate with each other. So I love this XKCD comic about the sort of joy of being able to explore this world and send back pictures and have those pictures show up on everyone's phones, right? Just the same way that we all, if we go on vacation to Italy, right, we're going to take pictures, we're going to put those on our social media feed, all of our friends are going to see it. That's what the rovers are doing on Mars, is basically what XKCD is saying there. And in fact, the rovers have been, incredible at taking their own selfies. In addition to images of Mars, there we have Opportunity, the rover Opportunity's first selfie on Mars, and Ingenuity and Perseverance are even better at it. But the upshot of all of this is that now when we see an image like this, which is from The Martian, of Mark Watney sitting on the Martian surface, viewing the horizon, we can very much understand what he's seeing in that, because we've seen so many images taken by the rovers that show essentially either close to identical views of a robot sitting in that same position looking at Mars. And we can imagine this not too distant future. I mean, this is certainly at least 100 or 200 years in the future, presented by television shows like The Expanse, which is one of my favorite shows of today, that imagines what life on Mars could look like, in which we have not just one individual exploring Mars the way that Mark Watney did in The Martian, but instead shows entire cities built into the hillsides of Mars, in which people have come to think of themselves not as humans from Earth who live on Mars, but rather as Martians who have their own politics and their own history. So it's definitely something that, again, fits into our contemporary image of what Mars is, and in particular, what it would take to survive on the planet. And here's a wonderful object I was able to collect for the museum for our Futures in Space exhibition, which is a helmet that's worn by one of the characters in The Expanse, who is a member of the Martian Marine Corps and also a citizen of the Martian Republic. Bobby Draper is her character's name. And so we are going to, present that helmet as an example of how we are imagining today this future of humans on Mars and what it means to become Martian. And we now have this story thanks to the exploration of Mars and all of the planetary science that's taken place over the past several decades, that yes, we have now this planet that is a dry, cold desert world. But at one point in its past, we know from what we've found in those rocks that we've explored there, at one point in its past, it was a warm and wet world similar to Earth. But that was billions of years ago, unfortunately. And so far, all of our efforts to try and discover any kind of life that might have taken root during that early period has been, unsuccessful. Doesn't mean we'll never find life on Mars or evidence that life did exist there, but it means that Mars very quickly in its history, at least in geologic timeframes, became inhospitable to any form of life. And especially, particularly today, because it's what we're interested in, it's very inhospitable to humans. But maybe it once wasn't. Maybe it once was a habitable world, and maybe it could be again. I am a historian, so I don't take any position on what the future of Mars could hold. And we're already preparing to at least try to send humans to Mars, whether that's going to mean transforming the planet in the way that it's been transformed in shows like The Expanse, or just sending sort of limited scientific missions. We don't know, but the technology at least is being prepared today for those potential missions. This, for example, is an inflatable heat shield that was tested on Earth. It was flown into space and then dropped so that it could be tested in re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere. And the Earth's atmosphere is actually much harsher than Mars's atmosphere when it comes to heat shields, at least. And it appears to have been a successful test. So the technologies right now are being developed to send at least a small number of humans to Mars. And, there are, as we know, powerful voices right now in politics that want to see humans sent to Mars sometime in the near future. So again, I don't take any position on what the future might hold. But I'll end things there with the idea that there is a human future for Mars, whether it's us continuing to look at it and explore it with robots or actually landing humans there. I couldn't tell you, but there's definitely a future. And whatever happens, it will reflect who we believe we are and what we think our purpose in the universe is, just as it has for all of human history. So thank you very much. And I look forward to answering your questions.
Great. Hey, thanks, Matt. Thanks, Matt. Well, we have Audrey has a question queued up. Audrey, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Okay. My question is there any evidence that microorganisms that are now part of our cells, animal cells and plant cells, like the chloroplasts and the mitochondria, that they might have arisen as independent organisms on Mars or some other planet millions of years ago?
As far as I know, there isn't any evidence of that. There are a lot of theories. There is the theory of panspermia, the idea that life could have taken root on another planet and then been transported somehow on a meteorite or who knows to the Earth, and that is how life began. But as far as I know, there's no evidence for that actually having happened. But at the same time, the origin of life on Earth is something that happened so long ago that there's really no direct evidence about exactly how it happened there either. That's another one of these stories that science has been piecing together through what they can see today in various chemical evidence within the cell. But yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating question, and it's one that scientists have been thinking about for quite a while, but one that so far there hasn't been any evidence for.
Thank you.
And I
Roger, you're up
apologize,
next.
you might hear my cat complaining near me here.
Roger's up next.
Oh, I just wanted to ask your thoughts about why it is that people through the ages in many different cultures look to the heavens to find causes of things that happen on Earth. It strikes me that here's this, and I guess the thing about planets is that their path is irregular, so it doesn't fit in with the other stars, and people notice that, but why? Okay, you notice these planets are not conforming to everything else, but why would that have an influence here on Earth? What is the why did, I mean, it's in so many different cultures that
Yeah.
I find it striking.
Well, to answer that, I like to think about what Ptolemy wrote about it in the Tetrabiblos that I mentioned before, which was when he's writing the sort of first part of the first book is explaining why do we believe in astrology, and he says, well, it's obvious. We can tell from the most powerful objects in the sky that they have an effect on what happens on Earth, right? We know that the motion of the sun, and when it's in different parts of the sky, when it does, moves through its path in different times of the year, it brings different changes. It causes things to grow. It causes things to eventually get cold, right? The motion of the sun and its position in the sky have a very notable effect. And he says the same is true of the moon. And we can watch it go through its phases. We know that it changes. We speculate that it has effects on the weather, on the atmosphere, on water. And he says, those are just the two that we see the most clearly. Then we have all of the other planets, and we can assume that they have just as important effects as the sun and moon, but maybe more subtle. And so it's that working from analogy that Ptolemy explains is why we should believe that the planets have those effects. And remembering that they didn't make really any distinction between the sun, the moon, and the planets. They were all sort of the same family of objects in the sky. So I think it comes from that, from taking what folks knew or could infer about what the sun and the moon were doing, and then applying them to the other moving objects in the sky.
Okay, thank you for that.
Okay, Joan, you're up next.
Okay, hi. Before I ask my question, I just was wondering whether you know my very good friend who's another historian of science at the Smithsonian, Pam Henson.
Oh, yes, of course.
Yeah, well, she's a close friend of mine. I've known her for years.
Oh, fantastic. Yes, I know Pam.
Good. We have a monthly discussion group of philosophers and historians of science. So I'm in touch with her monthly. So my question is about language. I should know this, but I don't know whether Mars was named for the god of war or the god of war was named for the planet.
I think it was that Mars was named for the god of war, not the other way around.
So the word Mars was first applied to a god.
Yes, I believe so. And then applied to the planet.
And
although I have to say I'm not an expert on ancient science or culture, so I could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure that's the case.
So, and the connection is because Mars is red? Is that what makes it warlike?
Well, I mean, again, there's not really a lot of explanatory text out there. You know, we don't know the moment when the decision was made and how it was rationalized, but we can infer again that it was sort of about that, you know, unruly motion in the sky and its redness. And also, you know, when the Greeks and then the Romans were assigning their gods to the planets, they had even more ancient traditions and names that they were overwriting. So, right, like you know, the god of war, the god of the underworld was already associated with Mars in other older cultures. And they were sort of borrowing a lot of the astrology that they applied was being borrowed from these older cultures. So no one was really inventing it out of nowhere.
Mhm. Right. I was just thinking that those were literate cultures. They wrote things down. Of course, a lot has been lost. So I
Yes.
could be historic records.
Yeah, so there's so much of the history of humans thinking about Mars that we just know nothing about because either it wasn't recorded or nothing survived. And it would be amazing to have a time machine and be able to go back and try to put that story together. But there's so many thousands of years of people looking at the sky that we can only guess what they understood they were seeing.
Well, we continue to find fragments of writing. So there's hope.
Yeah.
Sarah?
Yes. Thank you so much, Matthew. Matt, this was so interesting. I am going to stir up trouble. I noticed on your bio for Georgetown that you also are a poet. And I was curious whether you published any of your poetry, but I was most interested because it talks about how you focus on the intersection of science and religion in the American Cold War and other topics. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So yeah, I don't call myself a poet anymore.
Okay.
But I did at one point. I wrote poems and I published a book in 2008 called In Another Castle that was based on poems that I had written throughout college and then in an MFA creative writing program. And I do feel like even though I don't write poetry anymore, it's part of what drew me to aspects of this project, especially to thinking about Dante and Kierkegaard and these other writers in terms of the worlds that they were trying to create through their writing and how they were using writing to build those worlds and understand them in ways that you couldn't understand them just through math and numbers and observations, right? To the sort of creative work. If you know, I hate that now there's this generative AI sort of concept that's because I want to call it sort of generative poetics or something like that. But yeah, I think that that does inform my approach to this, and then also, as you mentioned, to thinking about that intersection of science and religion, because both science and religion are these world building exercises about understanding why things happen in our lives and why the world is the way it is. And for some figures like the chemist who I wrote my first book about, Harold Urey, he had, you know, both a religious upbringing and a scientific training and upbringing and identity as a Nobel Prize winning scientist. And I saw him, especially after World War II into the Cold War, trying to find some reconciliation between the two because he became very frightened that that the world wouldn't survive without some form of moral code that would keep us from blowing ourselves up. And despite his love of science and his, you know, faith in his fellow scientists, he didn't see science as being capable of providing that. And so he had sort of turned his back on religion for several years there prior to the Cold War, and he saw himself sort of coming back to it and arguing that not that he wanted to go back to the religion that he was brought up with, but that he wanted to see a new religion formed from what we know about the universe through science and the sort of traditional moral teachings that come from religion. So that became sort of the subject of my dissertation, trying to figure out what he was thinking and piece that together from different things that he wrote and speeches that he gave, what his vision of this was. And then that got incorporated into that first book, The Life and Science of Harold C. Urey. So yeah, again, though, it's like he's trying to build something, right? He's not just studying the world, he's building something. And so I consider all of that to be kind of poetics, right? Poetics is building things out of language or ideas or emotion or whatever it happens to be.
Thank you. I think too, just the idea that we can all have dialogue about those two things that seem to be at odds with one another is a good start. So
yeah, I agree.
Joe, you're up.
Yes, thank you. Matt, as I think about everything you talked about in the historical part of it, we seem to start out with the Mayans, and things happen, and they try to explain those things by the motions of the three planets, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, I suppose, and that gets pretty good coverage as long as those things turn out to be good predictions.
Mhm.
That lasts for a long time, and that even it comes over to Europe in effect. And the Greeks pick up on that too. Not that they were talking to the Mayans, but they come up with a similar idea. And the Romans carry that forward. So, and then we get into the religion gets into this heavily. And some of the greatest scientists back then, Aquinas, philosophers, are talking about it. But religion requires some form of perfection somehow in it, and everything has to be a perfect circle. And scientists go crazy when they note that these orbits of Mars and the Moon are not perfectly circular, and they go to great trouble to have circles within circles within circles to explain all of that. And then Kepler comes along and blows it all up by saying they're not going in circles. Can you just, other than listening to me, just give you a reprise of what I heard today? Can you add anything to that, or is that pretty much a rough view of what happens?
No, that's good. I mean, and for the Mayans, one thing I didn't talk about was, and for most ancient cultures, this is what was frustrating about writing a book about Mars, is that most ancient cultures were much more interested in Venus, because Venus does more in terms of changing its position in the night sky and does it so much more often, right? Because sometimes it comes up in the morning before the sun, sometimes it comes out in the evening right after the sun has gone down. So it's like, is Venus in front of the sun or is it behind the sun? Where does Venus actually exist? And so it also then could be, because it does that in such regular motions, it could be incorporated into calendrical practices. And so the Mayan calendar is based on the movement of Venus through its cycles. But Mars didn't have that same sort of regularity, which is why it's considered unruly. But yeah, so ancient cultures around the world noticed both of those things. They all noticed what Venus was doing. They all saw what Mars was doing and said, why are these two things so different from each other? And came up with explanations for why that might be and what their effects might be on Earth. And then, yeah, you're right. So Ptolemy, based on Aristotle's writings and his own observations, comes up with not just this, Ptolemy introduces that sort of complicated form of the nested spheres in which you have circles within circles, and introduces the world to that problem. And we have this vision that astronomers for centuries after that just accepted it and kept doing the work the same way that Ptolemy did it. But in fact, they were all like, what the hell is going on? You know, astronomers wrote from the 8th century onward, from the Muslim world into the Christian world, all of these treatises about how there's these big problems with Ptolemy. How are we going to solve these problems with Ptolemy? We're tired of circles in circles. So nobody liked circles in circles, but nobody knew how to fix the problem. Even Copernicus, when he drew up his system, used perfect circles and it still didn't work, even though he now had the planets in the order we know them today. And yeah, Kepler said, no, you got to use ellipses. You can't use circles. And he figures all of that out by tracking the motions of Mars in the sky and saying, this is why Mars looks like it's doing this weird thing. It's because we're on the inside, it's on the outside, and it's not moving in a circle. It's moving in an ellipses. And, you know, that's the foundation of how we think about the solar system today is there. And then, you know, Newton comes along and gives us gravity and tells us why the planets are moving relative to the sun. And then later work gets done that abolishes the ether. There's no longer any ether. It's empty space. Gravity is governing everything. So, you know, there is that kind of long arc of a story of how we get to now with everybody always, I mean, always starts with complaints about why is this system not make sense? And I think Ptolemy was like, he was the target of so much of that for hundreds of years before finally, you know, we get to the scientific revolution.
May I add a note to that?
Yeah.
One of my favorite quotations, which I'm not going to quote accurately, was one of the kings of Spain, when shown the Ptolemaic system of epicycles. He said, well, were I present at the creation, I would have made the universe on a simpler plan.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, you know, for all of those years, you probably know, there was sort of a separation between practical astronomy and observing the stars and figuring things out about where they were actually going to be, and this sort of like ideal astronomy of course it's perfect circles, that's how God wanted it, and it's like we'll ignore that unless we need it. But that's not how things really are. This is, you know, yeah.
The Ptolemaic system was pretty good for navigation, though.
Oh yeah, I mean it was a useful system. That's why it stuck around for hundreds of years.
Right.
So if I can do a follow-up question, religion slowly disappears during this 2 or 3,000 year period you've been talking about. Why do you think that happened? Or do you even agree that that's true?
I wouldn't say that it disappeared. I would say that it sort of, there's a story there of how, you know, especially in Europe, up through the scientific revolution, the church is, you know, it's one of the main governing bodies of all of Europe. It's also employing most of the scientists or people who we would today call scientists. And that changes over the course of the next few hundred years to where, you know, universities become more independent of the church, and then also science becomes a profession as opposed to something that priests and other wealthy folks are doing. So I don't think religion disappears, it just becomes less integrated with science, and science sort of claims dominion over, you know, explanations of the universe, at least in terms of its form and motions and everything.
Thank you. We've let's see, it's 7:20 there, so we've already wiped out a good part of your dinner hour. So we really do appreciate someone from the East Coast talking to us. Any last questions before we applaud?
We'd love to hear from any other folks at the Smithsonian who would like to speak to us, if I may be so bold. We really enjoy having folks with your broad background speak to us. It's just absolutely a real treat. And so,
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of us at the Smithsonian. So if you want any introductions, I'll be happy to help you find folks.
that would be really great. Thank you so much. I hate to presume, but you know.
Well, we're always happy to talk. And, you know, we're all you know, federal employees, civil servants. So we're here to serve you.
Awesome. Awesome. I would guess that most of us today have been to the museum in the past at some point. And it's always, you know, there's never enough time when you're in DC to see everything you want to see, but the Smithsonian is always at the top of the list. So.
Oh,
And we hope you remain and prosper.
oh, thank you.
So I want to thank you for your time this evening for you. Bravo for that. And to remind everybody, this will be posted on YouTube sometime next week. Just go to the Ashby Village website. You can do that too, Matt. You can go to the Ashby Village website and you'll be directed to, I see Hillary's already posted the information about it, and that's usually available around Monday of next week. Well, again, thank you very much.
Oh, we really appreciate it. Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.